You take their salary, divide by 2,080 hours. That's your new hourly rate. You're a non-exempt employee. You're going to be earning the same, but you're going to be required to clock in and clock out now. So who are the employees that you might consider doing that for? I would say those whose current salary is well below the new minimum, so you're not going to bump them up to the higher salary. Somebody that's making $30,000, $35,000, you're just not going to absorb that new cost in salary. But those employees also rarely, if ever, work more than 40 hours a week. So, you know, you're not necessarily getting an increased labor cost by converting them to hourly, because, and you're able to sort of keep them at the same pay level. The pros are, again, it's relatively easy implementation. You've probably already got employees who are clocking in and out. You've got the processes in place to do that. And again, I think employees are going to generally be fine with that. I mean, there may be some disappointment with the lost level of prestige or flexibility that comes from being salaried, but by and large, they're going to be earning the same. They may even have the potential to earn a little bit more if they occasionally work overtime. The cons is that the employees do lose that workplace flexibility. Employees that are used to sort of coming and going and as an exempt employee now have to clock in and out, and they may find that, you know, they just lose that flexibility, and sort of an unhappy thing for some employees. Again, there's could be increased labor costs. If you're going to sort of go this route, I think you want to make sure that the employees that you're converting, you kind of want to have a good grasp on what kind of overtime you can expect from them. You may think they're only working 40 hours a week, but then all of a sudden you're getting 5-10 hours of overtime for these employees that you thought were working typically an 8-to-5 job. So you might expect some increased cost that it may be difficult to budget for. The third option is you can, and some of these are variations on the same option, but the third option is you can convert somebody to a non-exempt position and limit them to 40 hours a week. You can by policy tell employees, okay, you are non-exempt, but we are not going to, you are disallowed from working overtime without prior authorization from your manager or something like that. That way you can control overtime costs better, because they have to come to you or to their manager to get authorization to exceed the 40-hour limit, and you can sort of cap that risk of increased overtime. Who would that be good for? Again, it's probably those whose current salary is well below the new minimum and they rarely work more than 40 hours a week anyway. Or if you're an employer who is willing to hire more employees to avoid paying overtime. If you are trying to avoid overtime and you've got 5 employees who work 50 hours a week, you may decide, well, instead of having those raising their salaries or doing whatever, we may hire a 6th employee to sort of cover the extra overtime, the extra productivity that we might do there. Or if you have the opportunity to reassign certain duties from an employee to another employee who is maybe exempt, or to another non-exempt employee, so that you can guarantee that they can get their work done within the 40-hour cap. The pros are, again, you can control labor costs better. Employees will generally be happy to say you can't work more than 40 hours a week and you're going to essentially be paid the same. The cons are you do have to find some way to make up for the lost productivity that comes from saying you can't work more than 40 hours a week now, and whether you're going to shift duties to others or hire other people. And then the other thing, you have to be prepared to enforce people who go over that 40-hour limit through discipline. You're still going to have to pay employees that exceed the 40-hour. At least I would advise you to pay them their overtime premiums. But you can treat it as a disciplinary issue, but a lot of employers don't want to have to discipline an employee for working more than 40 hours a week, and it becomes a difficult thing to supervise. The fourth option is you can convert the employees to non-exempt with a lower hourly rate to account for the overtime hours that are worked. There's nothing in the regulations that say you have to convert an exempt employee to whatever their hourly rate is. If you've got an employee that is making $40,000 a year, and you know that they're working 50 hours a week, you could convert that employee to a lower hourly rate than what they would have been if you had converted them just dividing by the 40 hours a week, convert them to a lower, and then build into that you know they're going to be working overtime. And so there's nothing that says that you can't take that $40,000 a year employee who would otherwise convert to about $20 an hour and pay them $16 an hour, because you know that they're going to be working overtime that makes up that difference. And that way you can continue to have them work the same number of hours for roughly the same compensation. Who would you consider doing that for? I would say the employees who typically work more than 40 hours a week, and those extra hours worked are fixed or predictable. You know that somebody works 45 hours every week. They work 9-hour shifts, or they work 48 hours every week, because they work 12-hour shifts 4 days a week. You know exactly how much they're going to work, so you're able to calculate with some level of precision what their new hourly rate would be, that when you add in the overtime premium, they're going to roughly receive the same amount of compensation. The pros is this, that you can keep your payroll levels the same. You don't have increased labor costs for the same amount of work. The downside is employees are generally going to be unhappy with this approach. They're going to see it as, I got a pay cut. They're going to be very unhappy, or could potentially be unhappy with this approach. So it may be a hard sell for some of your employees, and you may have to be willing to expect maybe some level of attrition as employees say, I'm not going to take this, what I perceive as a pay cut, and go elsewhere. You have to be prepared for that potential response. The other con is, I would say that you want to make sure you have a pretty good grasp on the number of hours that they work. So you might want to do some hour audits and things like that, so that you're not just plucking a number out of the air, and so that you have a pretty good sense that we really are keeping labor costs, and we're able to determine this hourly rate in a way that we're going to be paying them roughly the same for the same amount of work. The fifth option, salary non-exempt. People frequently, employers equate being salaried and being exempt as the same thing. Well, the FLSA actually allows you to pay non-exempt employees a salary, so long as that salary meets the minimum wage and that you compensate them for overtime for hours worked in excess of 40. So there's nothing that says that you can't pay somebody a fixed salary who is a non-exempt employee. We're going to pay you the same salary we've been paying you before. We're paying you $35,000 for the amount of work that you do up to 40 hours a week. Now, you'd have to pay them overtime if they exceed that 40 hours a week, but you can pay them the same salary before. So who might you consider doing this for? Employees, again, that typically don't work more than 40 hours a week, but that you want to maintain at some level of professionalism or prestige or something that, and give them that same level of guaranteed salary even when their work drops below 40 hours a week. It'd be some of the pros of this is that you can control labor costs. Again, you simply converting somebody to, you're paying them the same salary that they've been paid before. I think that employees will generally be satisfied with this result. Some of the cons is that you still have to pay overtime if they exceed more than 40 hours a week, and depending upon what sort of arrangement you made with the employee for what the salary is intended to cover, it can be a little tricky to calculate what their regular rate of pay would be. For example, if your salary is intended to cover somebody that's working up to 30 hours a week on a salary non-exempt, and you made it clear that's intended to cover up to 30 hours a week, then that time between 30 and 40 would still be considered non-overtime work, and you'd pay them their regular rate of pay above the salary. But then if they work over 40, they would have to be paid time and a half above that. But if you're setting a salary non-exempt position for a number of hours that's below 40, either through scheduling or sort of expectations or what you're telling them, then it can be a little trickier sometimes to make sure that you pay them for hours that they work in excess of whatever you have agreed upon. And the last two, I'm going to generalized to some degree. There's a little bit of math involved. I won't make anybody do any math. But the last two are probably the least sort of well-known and maybe the trickiest to implement. So before I sort of describe them, I sort of discourage you from maybe going down that route without getting some good advice about how to practice. But there are a couple of options that are worth considering under certain circumstances. One is that you can pay somebody a fixed salary for greater than 40 hours that's intended to cover their straight time up to a certain amount. So you could, for example, pay somebody a fixed salary that's intended to cover all their straight time up to 50 hours. So you say, we're going to pay you, so long as you meet minimum wage, obviously. We're going to pay you $1,000 a week for up to 50 hours. That $1,000 a week is intended to include all of your straight time. Now you still have to pay the overtime premium for the time that's worked over 40, but you're only paying that at the 0.5 rate because you've already paid them for their straight time. So you paid them $1,000 a week that was intended to cover all of their straight time, and then the hours that are between 40 and 50, you have to pay the 0.5 premium based on their regular rate of pay. So you'd have to pay them that extra if they were making what would break out to $20 an hour, the extra $10 for the time between 40 and 50. Now doing this, it can be useful for an employee that you know, again, works more than 40 hours a week and works a fairly steady schedule, that you're able to give them the same sort of level of pay and sort of control your overtime costs in a much narrower range than you would otherwise be doing by paying them just an hourly rate. And then they have the fluctuations that go with, I worked less this week, so I get a much smaller check, or I work much more, and then the employer has to pay time and a half in a way that, there's just wide variations in the amount of pay that they receive from week to week. It allows you as an employer to budget a little better because you know essentially what you're going to pay if they're working, for example, 50 hours a week every week, and they're reporting their time that way and it's scheduled. It looks and feels like a salary for the employee, even though there is built-in overtime that they are receiving. But you do need to be prepared to pay them extra above and beyond the time that you've agreed to. So if you've got an agreement that we're paying you straight time for up to 50 hours and they work 60 hours, then you need to be able to prepare to pay time and a half for that between 50 and 60 hours that they work. The final one that I will talk about is something that's called the fluctuating work week method. Just kind of three parts to this. This is the one that requires sort of a lot of math if you're going to sort of go this route, but you can do it through spreadsheets and things like that. But the way it works is that you pay somebody a fixed salary, a straight time pay for whatever time they work. You're not agreeing to a certain number of hours. You're saying we're paying you a fixed time salary. In the example I use, $750 a week, and that's intended to cover your straight time pay for how many ever hours that you work. The employee then receives 0.5 times their regular rate of pay for any hours worked over 40. So there's going to be overtime premium if they exceed the 40 hours. But, and here's the kicker, because you've agreed to pay them their straight time for whatever hours they've worked, that overtime, their regular rate of pay changes depending upon the number of hours that they've worked in a week. And so when you're calculating the overtime premiums, the regular rate of pay is going down as the employee is working more hours. So that when an employee works 60 hours a week, their regular rate of pay has gotten so much smaller than it would otherwise be if you had just paid them an hourly rate, that the overtime premium then becomes a much smaller part of what they're paid than if they were just paid an hourly rate or treated as a sort of a typical non-exempt employee. Now, why would you ever do this? Well, you do this sometimes for employees that work a wide variety of fluctuating hours. So you have somebody who in busy seasons is working 60, 70 hours a week, but then there are down times where maybe they don't work but 20 hours, or they just don't have as much work to do. but you're wanting to attract employees that have some level of a guaranteed sort of minimum that they're going to be paid every week, because they're, you know, they've got mortgages to pay that's the same every month, no matter, you know, how much they pay. So if you've got employees that sort of have this widely fluctuating number of hours that they work, then you might go this route because it gives the employee some baseline level that they're going to be paid every week through a salary, and then, but it also gives the employer the sort of a narrow range of overtime. They work a huge amount of overtime one week. You shouldn't expect to have to pay them 2 times what you would normally pay, because their regular rate of pay is going down in a way that the overtime premiums are much smaller. So I helped a client sort of put into place this for a fairly large employer that had lots of salespeople. Well, salespeople cannot be classified as under any of the white-collar exemptions. Under the administrative exemption, you would think that sales would be one of those sort of functions, but it's not. Sales is explicitly excluded from being able to be classified as exempt under the administrative exemption. So they were looking at we pay our salespeople a salary because that's what allows us to attract people, as opposed to paying them purely a commission basis for some of the other exemptions like outside sales or inside sales. We want to pay them a salary to attract them this way, but their work hours fluctuate so much that well, we can't pay them a salary because it would be we can't classify them as exempt. But then we also don't want to have to incur these huge overtime expenses during the times that they're really working and selling a lot. And plus they want some sort of guaranteed minimum that allows us to sort of attract high quality talent. And so we put into place this fluctuating work week method to where they essentially, no matter how much time they work, the range at which they're ultimately paid is pretty narrow when you factor in how the overtime premium being such a smaller part of what they make. Now the caveat is it has to be somebody that actually works fluctuating hours. You can't put this in place for somebody that works 8 to 5 every week. But if you've got employees in which there is this is one of the options to consider. I don't want to keep people late, but I do want to answer questions. I know I flew through a lot of that sort of really quickly. Some of these options, I just want to sort of present that there's sort of more options than just do we raise the salary or we convert them to non-exempt at their hourly rate. That there's a lot of considerations that can go into how are we going to do this, and there's lots of different options that maybe work better for different employees. And so hopefully that's helpful, but if you, some of these latter ones, if you're really looking at implementing this, I would suggest that you get a little bit advised, make sure that whatever you implement is ultimately going to satisfy the requirements of the FLSA, and maybe get sort of final approval from an attorney before you sort of implement that one. But some of the ones at the beginning are pretty easy to adopt. So anybody have any questions?
Yes. Does this apply to nonprofits?
Yes. So there are special rules for nonprofits, but they're pretty narrow. If your nonprofit, and actually Dinah can probably speak a little better to Dinah's with the ARC can speak a little better to some of this than I can, because I haven't looked too closely at those. But if the nonprofit has certain transactions across business lines, and they deal with more than, was it $500,000 a year, then it applies to nonprofits. But then there can be certain types of employees that it can apply to but not apply to. Sorry, it's not a great answer, but it's a trickier situation than I can maybe give you in 5 seconds. But we'll talk after, and I can give you some specific materials and thoughts on that.
Commission-only salespeople earning significantly above $47,000 a year. Do we even consider overtime in those cases, or do we?
If you have commission only and they're properly classified, because there are 2 exemptions. There's an inside salesperson and an outside salesperson, and there are certain specific requirements that go along with those that there is not a salary basis test for or overtime requirements, so long as they meet the requirements for that special exemption. But if they're classified as an inside or outside sales exemption, this overtime analysis doesn't apply, but other things do. that, you know, if you feel safe that they're properly classified in that way, then you don't have to adjust those.